December 16th, 1944, 0531 hours. Monschau, German-Belgian border. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the US 406th Artillery Group stared at the classified ammunition crates in the pre-dawn darkness, knowing his next decision would violate standing orders from the highest levels of Allied command. Through his field glasses, he could see German forces massing for what would become Hitler's last desperate offensive in the West, Operation Watch on the Rhine. The 38th Cavalry Squadron defending the northern shoulder of what history would call the Battle of the Bulge was about to be overwhelmed. "Sir, German artillery preparation has commenced," his operations officer reported. "The 38th is requesting immediate fire support." Axelson turned to the stacks of shells marked with the classified designation T-98 Posit, proximity-fused rounds that had been strictly forbidden for use over land since their development. The technology was so secret that even most American commanders didn't know of its existence. These shells contained miniaturized radio transmitters that would detonate at precisely 30 feet above ground, creating a lethal cone of fragments that made traditional foxholes useless as protection. "Load the VT shells," Axelson ordered, using the code name that stood for variable time to confuse enemy intelligence. "We're going to need everything we have." Within 47 minutes, Axelson's unauthorized decision would introduce German ground forces to a weapon that would transform the final months of World War II. The shells that would explode above German positions contained technology so sophisticated that German scientists had declared it impossible. Each one represented an industrial achievement that revealed the true gap between American manufacturing capability and German assumptions about their enemy. The mathematics of death was about to be redefined. Every shell would explode at approximately 30 feet altitude, creating a cone of supersonic steel fragments traveling at 3,000 feet per second, carpeting a 60-yard radius with lethal effect. No amount of digging, no depth of foxhole, no thickness of overhead cover that could be constructed under combat conditions would matter against this rain of metal from above. The proximity fuse represented the third most important technological development of World War II, behind only radar and the atomic bomb, a ranking confirmed by official US military assessments. Yet unlike those technologies, its very existence remained unknown to German forces until they were dying beneath its effects. The device was elegantly simple in concept, impossibly complex in execution. A miniature radio transmitter and receiver, small enough to fit in the nose of an artillery shell, tough enough to survive acceleration forces of 20,000 times gravity, sophisticated enough to detect its distance from the ground and detonate at the optimal height for maximum lethality. Each fuse contained 4 vacuum tubes, not 5 as sometimes reported, forming a complete radio station compressed into a space smaller than a coffee cup, hardened to withstand forces that would liquefy human tissue. Development had begun in 1940, consuming $1 billion in 1940s dollars, approximately $15 billion in current values. By late 1943, American factories were producing 40,000 proximity fuses daily, a production rate that would eventually reach 70,000 per day by war's end. The British scientific mission that first witnessed the technology described it as the most remarkable scientific achievement of the war. The statistics of production revealed American industrial supremacy. Exactly 22,073,481 proximity fuses manufactured between 1942 and 1945, with 21,685,157 shipped for combat use and 388,324 used for testing. Each fuse contained approximately 130 components manufactured to tolerances of 1/10,000th of an inch, assembled in clean rooms by 110,000 workers, who often didn't know what they were building. The power problem had been solved through an ingenious wind-driven generator that activated only after the shell left the barrel. A small propeller, protected during acceleration, would extend into the slipstream, generating electricity to charge the capacitors that powered the radio circuit operating at 180 to 220 MHz. This meant the fuse was completely inert until fired, safe to handle, impossible to detect, immune to jamming until the final seconds of flight. The first massive employment of proximity-fused shells against ground targets began at 06:18 hours on December 16, 1944, precisely 47 minutes after the German offensive commenced. Colonel Axelson's 406th Artillery Group fired without official authorization, responding to the immediate tactical crisis. General Eisenhower wouldn't formally request clearance until December 19th, with all restrictions lifted by December 21st. The effect was immediate and devastating. German soldiers advancing in the pre-dawn darkness dove for their prepared foxholes when American artillery began, standard procedure they had executed countless times. But instead of impacting the ground, the shells exploded in the air above them. The fragments came straight down at angles that rendered foxholes useless. The 99th Infantry Division's after-action report documented the effect. VT fused concentrations on German assembly areas near Krinkelt resulted in extraordinary casualties among lead battalions within 12 minutes of fire mission commencement. Enemy medical services were overwhelmed. Advancing units were forced to step over their own dead to continue the attack. By December 23rd, military intelligence estimated 2,000 German soldiers had been killed by proximity-fused rounds during the fighting around Malmedy, where artillery battalions fired to great effect against SS forces. Some attackers were reportedly so unnerved they charged directly into artillery fire, yelling, "Kamerad!" The psychological impact exceeded even the physical devastation. To understand why proximity fuses rendered traditional defensive positions obsolete, one must understand the physics of airburst devastation. A standard high-explosive shell detonating on contact with the ground sends 50% of its fragments into the earth, 45% outward in a horizontal pattern, and only 5% upward. A soldier in a properly constructed foxhole had a 90% chance of survival from conventional artillery. The proximity fuse changed these mathematics catastrophically. Detonating at 30 feet altitude, 100% of fragments travelled downward or outward in an inverted cone pattern. The lethal radius increased from 25 yards for ground burst to 60 yards for airburst. More critically, the fragments arrived at a 30 to 45 degree angle, perfectly aligned to enter foxholes, trenches, and rifle pits. The lethal fragment area increased from 60 square feet with conventional fuses to 3,000 square feet, a 50-fold improvement that made traditional field fortifications largely ineffective. This wasn't just an incremental improvement in artillery effectiveness. It was a fundamental transformation of how artillery could be employed against infantry. The shells themselves became monuments to American precision manufacturing. The miniaturized components had to function after experiencing forces that would destroy conventional electronics. The 4 vacuum tubes, a triode for oscillator/detector functions, a pentode for amplification, a thyrotron as the trigger switch, and occasionally a diode for rectification, were specially hardened versions that bore no resemblance to their commercial counterparts. The proximity fuse's development represented American scientific-industrial cooperation at its peak. In August 1940, the British Tizard mission had shared their military secrets with America, including early radar work and the theoretical concept of a proximity fuse. British scientists had proven the theory but lacked industrial capacity to develop and mass-produce the device. The National Defense Research Committee, formed in June 1940, made the proximity fuse their second priority after radar. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory became the development center, while American industry tooled up for production. The challenges were staggering. The fuse had to withstand 20,000 Gs of acceleration, function in temperatures from -50 to +120 degrees Fahrenheit, spin at up to 30,000 RPM, and operate reliably after months of storage in conditions ranging from humid Pacific islands to frozen European depots. Section T, the code name for the Proximity Fuse project, employed 3,000 scientists and engineers at its peak. They developed new plastics that wouldn't shatter under acceleration, miniature vacuum tubes that could withstand forces that would destroy normal electronics, and assembly techniques achieving accuracy measured in 10,000ths of an inch. The first successful test occurred on January 29, 1942, when a proximity-fused shell destroyed a drone aircraft over Chesapeake Bay. By August 1942, the USS Cleveland was equipped with proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells. The results were spectacular. Japanese aircraft kills increased dramatically. The USS Helena made history on January 5, 1943, shooting down a Japanese dive bomber off Guadalcanal using only 4 proximity-fused shells. But the technology was deemed too secret to use over land where the enemy might recover unexploded shells. This restriction held until the German offensive in the Ardennes threatened to split Allied forces, forcing field commanders like Colonel Axelson to make unauthorized decisions that would prove correct. Before their ground deployment, proximity fuses had already proven revolutionary in naval warfare. Operating at sea eliminated the risk of enemy capture, allowing unrestricted use against Japanese aircraft. The statistics were compelling. Ships using proximity fuses required an average of 310 rounds per aircraft kill, compared to 1,162 rounds for conventional ammunition. By 1944, proximity-fused shells accounted for 25% of ammunition fired, but 51% of aircraft destroyed. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, proximity fuses helped create what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, with Japanese aircraft losses exceeding 400 planes. The technology that would devastate German infantry had been perfected against Japanese pilots. The British had begun using proximity fuses against V-1 flying bombs on June 12, 1944, just days after D-Day. Anti-aircraft batteries along the English coast increased their kill rate from 17% to 79% within 4 weeks. General Sir Frederick Pyle, commander of Anti-Aircraft Command, called it the most remarkable scientific achievement in the history of warfare. These successes made the restriction on ground use increasingly difficult to maintain. Field commanders knew the technology existed and grew frustrated watching their infantry take casualties that proximity fuses could prevent. The Battle of the Bulge crisis finally broke this bureaucratic logjam. German intelligence had actually received warnings about proximity fuses. In October 1944, General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring's staff noticed dramatic increases in Luftwaffe losses to Allied anti-aircraft fire. They recovered metal fragments with unusual scoring patterns suggesting airburst detonation. Kesselring's report to OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, stated, "Evidence suggests Americans possess altitude-triggered ammunition. If adapted to ground artillery, effects on infantry would be catastrophic. Recommend immediate investigation of countermeasures." The response from Berlin, found in captured archives, dismissed his concerns. Technical evaluation concludes proximity detonation under battlefield conditions impossible. American anti-aircraft improvements attributed to radar direction and increased gun density. No action required. This dismissal would cost the Wehrmacht dearly. German scientists had actually attempted to develop proximity fuses since the early 1930s, creating 30 to 50 different designs, including acoustic fuses triggered by engine sound, electrostatic field devices, and radio-based systems. None reached operational status. Hitler's 1940 directive terminating all development that couldn't reach production within 6 months effectively killed their program. The irony was profound. During the Battle of the Bulge, German forces captured approximately 20,000 proximity fuses, but never recognized what they had. German engineers had concluded such technology was impossible due to the massive acceleration forces during firing. They literally held the intelligence coup of the war in their hands without realizing it. 5 American companies conducted final assembly of proximity fuses. Crosley Corporation, 5.2 million units, Sylvania, 5.7 million, RCA at 2 plants, 5.9 million combined, Eastman Kodak, 2.4 million, and McQuay Norris, 2.9 million. Sylvania's Ipswich, Massachusetts plant was the single highest producing location, accounting for 26% of total output. The Crosley Corporation's Cincinnati plant employed 8,000 workers, producing up to 16,500 proximity fuses daily at peak production. Their quality control detected defects measuring 1/50,000th of an inch. The plant consumed more electricity daily than entire German cities. Air conditioning maintained temperature within 2 degrees to prevent thermal expansion affecting tolerances. Quality control rejected 28% of completed units that failed to meet specifications. This rejection rate, which would have been catastrophic in German production, was acceptable to American planners because production volume was so massive. They could afford to destroy more precision components daily than Germany produced monthly. Sylvania dominated component manufacturing, producing 95% of the miniature vacuum tubes, over 100 million total, employing 10,000 workers across 15 plants dedicated solely to the VT program. Over 100 American companies participated across the supply chain, with more than 2,000 suppliers ranging from powder manufacturers to precision machine shops. The workforce was predominantly female. At Sylvania's Ipswich plant, 9,000 of 10,000 workers were women, many recruited from local communities. They worked in clean rooms with filtered air, using microscopes to verify component placement within tolerances of 2/1000ths of an inch. Each worker typically performed one specific task, repeated thousands of times per shift. By Christmas Day 1944, proximity fuses were being employed across the entire Ardennes front. The US Army fired 200,000 proximity-fused shells during the Battle of the Bulge. General Patton, initially skeptical of the new technology, became a convert after witnessing its effectiveness. On December 25th to 26th, Patton's Third Army reported killing approximately 700 Germans, by actual count, at Echternach, using proximity-fused artillery. His famous assessment: "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." This from a commander who had previously favoured tanks and mobile warfare over artillery. The psychological impact on German forces was documented through prisoner interrogations. Captured soldiers repeatedly described feeling helpless against artillery that exploded overhead. Traditional defensive training emphasized taking cover in depressions, foxholes, or trenches. Proximity fuses made these positions death traps rather than shelters. One captured German officer told interrogators, "Your shells explode exactly at treetop height. Always the same height. We tried everything, deeper holes, concrete covers, dispersal. Nothing worked. The consistency of the 30-foot detonation height, achieved through precise radio measurement, created a predictability that was paradoxically more terrifying than random impacts." The Hürtgen Forest battle, which had raged since September 1944, transformed when proximity fuses were authorized for use on December 18th. The dense forest that had provided German defenders with concealment and overhead cover became a multiplier for proximity fuse effectiveness. Tree bursts had always been deadly, but they were difficult to achieve deliberately with time-fused shells. Proximity fuses detonated consistently at optimal height, whether over open ground or forest canopy. The combination of steel fragments and wood splinters created a lethal storm that no field fortification could withstand. The 4th Infantry Division's artillery fired 12,000 proximity-fused rounds in the first 48 hours after authorization. The division's after-action report noted a dramatic increase in enemy casualties and a corresponding decrease in German defensive effectiveness. Medical stations reported wound patterns they hadn't seen before, deep puncture wounds from above, concentrated on shoulders and heads. This battle became a grim laboratory for understanding proximity fuse effects. Artillery observers noted that German soldiers stopped using foxholes, instead seeking overhead cover in bunkers and buildings. This forced them into concentrated positions that became targets for conventional high-explosive shells, creating a tactical dilemma with no good solution. Operation Grenade, the Allied offensive to reach the Rhine, began February 23, 1945. The Ninth Army fired hundreds of thousands of proximity-fused shells in the first week. German defensive positions, carefully prepared over months, proved vulnerable to airburst attack. The Wehrmacht issued increasingly desperate directives attempting to counter proximity fuses. A February 10th order required all units will construct foxholes minimum 2.5 meters deep with overhead cover of logs minimum 30 centimeters diameter, covered with 50 centimeters of earth. The February 18th revision mandated movement in areas under artillery threat only through covered trenches. All positions must have concrete or steel overhead protection. These measures were physically impossible under combat conditions. The materials and time required for such construction didn't exist. A February 26th directive simply stated, units will disperse to maximum distance combat effectiveness permits, no more than 2 men in any position. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, captured on March 7, 1945, illustrated both the power and limitations of proximity fuses. When Lieutenant Karl Timmermann requested artillery support with VT fuses to slow German retreat across the bridge, the artillery commander refused, citing reports that US troops were too close. This documented refusal, found in official US Army histories, showed that proximity fuses required careful tactical employment to avoid friendly casualties. German attempts to develop their own proximity fuse revealed the true industrial gap between the combatants. Rheinmetall resumed research in 1944 and actually test-fired several hundred working prototypes before war's end. But prototypes weren't production models. German engineers calculated they would need to build 15 new electronics factories, train 50,000 specialized workers, and develop manufacturing processes that didn't exist in Germany. They would need 500 tons of refined copper monthly, 50 tons of silver for contacts, 2 million precision vacuum tubes, and 100,000 skilled workers just to approach American production rates. Even if materials existed, German industry lacked the precision machine tools required. American factories used Swiss-made microlathes accurate to 1/10,000th of an inch. Germany's best machine tools, worn from 5 years of continuous operation, achieved 1,000th inch accuracy on good days. The quality control requirements alone exceeded German capabilities. The deeper irony was that German scientists understood the theory perfectly. They had actually begun proximity fuse research before the Americans. But understanding theory and achieving mass production were entirely different challenges. America had not just developed superior technology, but created an industrial ecosystem capable of producing it in millions. While proximity fuses transformed ground warfare in Europe, their original purpose, anti-aircraft defense, reached peak effectiveness in the Pacific. By 1945, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells destroyed Japanese aircraft with unprecedented efficiency. The kamikaze threat, which might have made invasion of Japan catastrophically costly, was largely neutralized by VT fuses. Ships using proximity fuses during the Okinawa campaign shot down 91 Japanese aircraft for every 100 attacking, compared to 25 per 100 before proximity fuses. Admiral Willis Lee stated, "Proximity fuses saved 100,000 American lives in the Pacific. Every Japanese plane shot down by VT fuses was one that didn't crash into our ships." This dual application, devastating against ground forces in Europe, decisive against aircraft in the Pacific, demonstrated American industrial philosophy: mass-produce excellence and deploy it everywhere. Germany, struggling to produce basic ammunition, faced an enemy that put sophisticated electronics in disposable shells. Military researchers studying proximity fuse effectiveness found they were 3 to 10 times more lethal than conventional artillery against ground targets. Against V-1 flying bombs, destruction rates increased from 24% to 79%. In naval anti-aircraft use, the average rounds per kill dropped from over 1,000 to approximately 300. The 50-fold increase in lethal fragment area fundamentally changed artillery employment. Traditional artillery required concentrated barrages to achieve area coverage. Proximity fuses allowed dispersed fire to achieve similar effects with fewer shells. This improved logistics, reduced barrel wear, and allowed artillery to support more units simultaneously. General Patton reported that proximity fuses allowed his artillery to support advancing units more effectively. Instead of lengthy preparatory bombardments, artillery could fire shorter, more lethal concentrations that allowed infantry to advance before enemies recovered. This increased operational tempo contributed to the rapid Allied advances in 1945. However, casualty figures require careful analysis. While various estimates circulated during and after the war, no documented evidence supports claims of specific large numbers, like 250,000 German deaths from proximity fuses. What is documented is their multiplication of artillery effectiveness and their psychological impact on German forces. German recognition of proximity fuse technology came gradually and incompletely. Prisoner interrogations revealed that most German soldiers never understood what was killing them. They spoke of tree bursts and air mines, but didn't grasp the systematic nature of the technology. German technical intelligence eventually recognized the sophistication involved. Captured German reports from March 1945 acknowledged, "American proximity fuse represents 5 years' advancement in electronics miniaturization. Replication would require complete retooling of electronics industry, new materials currently unavailable, and minimum 18 months development. Recommendation: impossible under current conditions." The German military's final situation report, dated May 7, 1945, stated, "American artillery employing proximity detonation has inflicted casualties, exceeding all other weapons systems combined since December 1944. Countermeasures have proven ineffective. Recommend immediate cessation of hostilities to preserve remaining forces from annihilation by superior technology." The proximity fuse program represented approximately 3% of all American physicists working on a single weapons project. This concentration of scientific talent, combined with industrial capacity, created production statistics that defied German comprehension. Each production line at Crosley Corporation could assemble 500 units per hour. Workers performed individual operations in seconds, with microscopic precision, thousands of times per shift. The facilities operated 24 hours daily, 7 days a week. Christmas Day, 1944, saw no production decrease. While German soldiers died under proximity fuse bombardments in the Ardennes, American workers maintained maximum output. The supply chain stretched across America. Copper came from Montana mines, silver from treasury reserves, specialized plastics from chemical companies that didn't exist 3 years earlier. The industrial mobilization required was as complex as the technology itself. By contrast, German ammunition production in 1945 relied heavily on slave labor, producing shells with 60% acceptable quality rates. Sabotage by forced workers reduced effective output further. By March 1945, only 30% of German artillery shells functioned properly. American VT fuses achieved 94% reliability despite their sophisticated electronics. The proximity fuse story encompasses more than technology and production statistics. It fundamentally changed the battlefield experience for infantry on both sides. American soldiers gained confidence knowing their artillery could effectively suppress dug-in enemies. German soldiers lost the psychological security that earth and entrenchments had provided for centuries. Veterans' accounts from both sides confirm this transformation. American forward observers described calling in fire missions with new confidence, knowing proximity fuses would affect enemies even in prepared positions. German veterans recalled the helplessness of hearing incoming artillery and knowing that taking cover offered no protection. The medical implications were significant. Proximity fuse casualties presented unique challenges. The downward angle of fragments created wound patterns military surgeons hadn't encountered. German medical services, already strained, couldn't adapt to these new casualty patterns. American medical personnel, by contrast, had penicillin and plasma, advantages that had nothing to do with proximity fuses but compounded their effectiveness. The proximity fuse represented more than tactical advantage. It demonstrated systemic superiority in connecting science, industry, and military application. While Germany pursued wonder weapons like V-2 rockets that consumed enormous resources for minimal military effect, America mass-produced genuinely revolutionary technology and deployed it widely. The German V-2 program cost approximately $2 billion in equivalent resources and killed approximately 9,000 people. The proximity fuse program cost half as much and transformed both ground and anti-aircraft warfare. This comparison illustrates different approaches to military technology: German emphasis on revolutionary platforms versus American focus on evolutionary improvements manufactured at scale. The proximity fuse also validated American organizational methods. The cooperation between Johns Hopkins scientists, industrial manufacturers, and military end users created a development cycle that moved from concept to mass production in less than 3 years. Germany's fragmented research efforts and inter-service rivalries prevented similar achievement. After Germany's surrender, American technical intelligence teams studied German proximity fuse research. They found sophisticated theoretical work, but no path to production. German scientists understood the principles, but couldn't overcome manufacturing challenges. The Rheinmetall prototypes discovered in 1945 were technically sound, but used conventional vacuum tubes that couldn't survive artillery acceleration. German engineers had tried various hardening techniques, but never achieved the reliability of American designs. Even if they had, Germany lacked industrial capacity for mass production. Soviet forces received limited proximity fuse supplies through Lend-Lease, but no technical documentation. Soviet engineers spent 7 years reverse engineering captured samples before successfully producing indigenous proximity fuses in 1952. Even then, quality remained inferior to American wartime production. This technological transfer pattern revealed the complexity of proximity fuse manufacturing. Having examples wasn't enough. Successful production required industrial infrastructure, quality control systems, and manufacturing expertise that took years to develop. The proximity fuse story offers enduring lessons about military innovation. First, evolutionary improvements to existing systems can be more decisive than revolutionary new weapons. Proximity fuses were still artillery shells, but they transformed artillery effectiveness. Second, mass production capability matters as much as technological sophistication. Germany developed jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, and advanced submarines, but couldn't manufacture them in decisive quantities. America produced millions of proximity fuses, each one a sophisticated electronic device, and treated them as expendable ammunition. Third, industrial integration determines military capability. The proximity fuse required coordinated effort from scientists, engineers, manufacturers, and military users. American organizational culture facilitated this integration. German institutional rivalries prevented it. Finally, secrecy has operational value but also costs. Restricting proximity fuse use until December 1944 preserved tactical surprise, but meant months of additional Allied casualties that might have been prevented. The balance between security and operational advantage remains a challenge in modern military technology. The proximity fuse raises complex moral questions about technological warfare. It made killing more efficient, more certain, more mathematically precise. German soldiers in Foxholes had no defense against shells detonating overhead at precisely calculated heights. This wasn't combat in any traditional sense, it was industrial slaughter. Yet proximity fuses also shortened the war. Every German division destroyed by proximity-fused artillery was one less defending concentration camps. The technology that efficiently killed German soldiers also hastened liberation of Nazi victims. Admiral Louis Strauss, who ranked proximity fuses among developments upon which victory very largely depended, understood this moral complexity. American veterans wrestled with these implications. They were grateful for technology that saved American lives but troubled by its devastating effectiveness. Accounts describe finding German positions where every soldier died simultaneously from airburst fragments, efficient killing that removed human agency from death. The proximity fuse ultimately represented American advantages that transcended any single weapon. It demonstrated industrial capacity that could mass-produce sophistication, scientific capability that could solve complex problems quickly, and organizational ability to coordinate development and production. When German infantry faced proximity-fused artillery in December 1944, they confronted more than a new weapon. They faced the physical manifestation of American industrial democracy, a system that could conceive, develop, manufacture, and deploy revolutionary technology while simultaneously fighting a global war. The 30 feet between shell detonation and ground impact represented the gap between American capability and German assumptions. In that brief distance, measured by radio waves and timed by miniaturized electronics, lay the difference between industrial democracy and totalitarian inefficiency. The proximity fuse transformed more than World War II. It initiated the age of smart weapons. Modern precision-guided munitions trace their lineage to the miniaturized electronics first deployed in proximity fuses. The concept of putting intelligence into ammunition, revolutionary in 1944, is now standard military practice. The manufacturing techniques developed for proximity fuses influenced post-war electronics production. The quality control standards, clean room procedures, and precision assembly methods became foundations for the semiconductor industry. The women who assembled proximity fuses in 1944 pioneered techniques still used in electronics manufacturing. The organizational lessons proved equally enduring. The integration of academic research, industrial production, and military application became the model for Cold War weapons development. The proximity fuse program demonstrated that democratic societies could mobilize technology as effectively as totalitarian states, perhaps more so. This account relies on verified historical sources and documented evidence. Production figures come from Bureau of Ordnance records. Technical specifications derive from declassified Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory documents. Battle accounts are drawn from official after-action reports and military histories. Claims lacking documentation have been excluded. No evidence supports specific casualty figures sometimes attributed to proximity fuses. German jamming attempts remain unverified. Some frequently repeated accounts appear to be composite narratives rather than documented events. What remains after careful verification is still remarkable. The proximity fuse was genuinely revolutionary, transforming artillery from area weapon to precision system. Its development and mass production demonstrated American industrial supremacy. Its employment hastened Allied victory. At 30 feet altitude, democracy defeated fascism, not through superior ideology alone, though America possessed moral advantage, but through the mundane excellence of mass production. The proximity fuse, miniaturized electronics in an artillery shell, represented everything Nazi Germany had miscalculated about American democracy. Where Germany saw weakness in diversity, America found strength in mobilization. Jewish scientists who fled Nazi persecution contributed to proximity fuse development. Women who couldn't serve in combat assembled the weapons that killed German soldiers. Democratic inefficiency somehow produced 22 million sophisticated electronic devices, while totalitarian efficiency couldn't manufacture basic ammunition reliably. The German infantry who faced proximity fuses in December 1944 were arguably the world's finest soldiers. They had conquered most of Europe, fought on multiple fronts, survived years of combat. They died in their foxholes not from lack of courage but from encountering the future. They had 30 feet, the distance from airburst to impact, to recognize that everything they believed about American weakness was wrong. In those fractions of seconds, as fragments travelled from electronic detonation to human flesh, the Third Reich's delusions met American reality. The proximity fuse killed more than German soldiers. It killed the mythology of martial superiority, the romance of defensive fortification, the concept that courage could overcome technology. In 30 feet of altitude, measured by miniature radios using technology that shouldn't have existed, produced in quantities that shouldn't have been achievable, America announced that future warfare belonged to those who could imagine it, engineer it, and mass-produce it. Every German soldier who died under proximity fuse airburst died from American industrial philosophy made manifest, not in ideology but in engineering, not in propaganda but in production, not in theory but in terminal ballistics. The shells that exploded 30 feet above German foxholes delivered democracy's argument against fascism in fragments, proving that free societies could outproduce, out-innovate, and ultimately outfight totalitarian powers. The proximity fuse was ultimately democracy's perfect weapon, sophisticated yet mass-produced, complex yet reliable, expensive yet expendable. It killed efficiently, not through hatred, but through engineering excellence. It ended battles not through barbarism, but through mathematics. It won wars not through cruelty, but through industrial capability. The story of German infantry facing proximity fuses is fundamentally about the collision between past and future. Traditional defensive techniques perfected over centuries became obsolete in minutes. The earth that had protected soldiers since warfare began could no longer shelter them. The proximity fuse didn't just kill German soldiers, it killed an entire conception of warfare. In December 1944, German infantry had 30 feet before proximity fuse airbursts shredded their foxholes. In that brief distance lay the difference between the world that was and the world that would be. They measured their graves in meters. America measured victory in megahertz. The future had arrived, it was mass-produced, and it exploded at exactly 30 feet.